Hey there. You're listening to episode 147 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Cody, and I'm here with my co-host and brother, Keelan. Today, we're talking to Caleb Breakey, author and founder of Renown Publishing. Caleb and the Renown Publishing team have worked with many generous leaders and families to bring their stories to life. Caleb is adamant that everyone has an incredibly valuable story to share, and that story is the most powerful way in which we speak into the lives of others. We had all sorts of questions about sharing your own generosity story, and you don't want to miss what he has to share. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you guys that everything we do here on the Finish Line podcast is 100% free and always will be. If you're getting a lot out of the podcast and want to help us get the message out to others, the best thing you can do for us right now is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the show so you're the first to know when new episodes come out. With that, let's get to the interview. All right, we're super excited to have Caleb Breakey joining us today. Caleb, thanks for being here.
Such a pleasure. Cannot wait to dive into our wonderful conversation, and hopefully everyone listening gets something very impactful from it.
So take us back to the early years. Tell us what life was like growing up, and if you could also share some of your faith journey along the way.
Absolutely. So grew up in what I would call a high control, high demand religion, Christianity, but with very little Jesus. So there was a lot of guilt, a lot of fear, a lot of shame. And I think the best way I can put it was faith was more about conformity than love and curiosity, where now on the other side, jumping way ahead, it was a huge part of my life journey was learning how to see people how God sees them, because there used to be so much judgment coming from me. Whereas now I show up and it's almost exciting to be like, wow, people get to experience Jesus through me in the room. And I mean, what a kid in a candy store that is compared to the way you used to feel about yourself, where it's like, I love making people feel bad about themselves.
And so as you were growing up, where did some of that transition really start to take root? Where did God start to plant some of those seeds? And how did he start to reshape your relationship, both with faith, but especially with him?
With faith, it was at a writing conference of all things. It was in Hawaii. And I remember just looking around and I said to my wife, these people live as though Jesus is real. And that blew my mind. It was always in my heart, this wanting to love God and love others. But we were taught that emotion was wrong. And so you got this emotional kid trying to suppress that his whole life. And now he sees people who just live with this freedom and this grace and this love. And that started the real spark. When it comes to storytelling, I had studied to be a journalist and worked really hard. I loved sports, so I got to cover the New York Yankees for MLB.com. And then I read basically one of the first fiction books that I ever read. And while I was reading it, this kind of fantastical story, I realized that I was rooting against the character of Jesus in the story and didn't know it. Meaning I was essentially yelling, crucify him. And that was like that breaking moment of like, wow, if story can do this, where I just read a fictionalized book, something that someone made up in their head, and I'm going to live differently because of it, that's what I want to tap into. I'm done writing game stories. I want to tap into whatever this is. And that started a 7-year journey of traditional publishing.
Yeah, I'd love to hear how you get from covering the Yankees to what you're doing today, which I know we're going to get more into, but what did that journey look like?
So I'm thinking, God, I don't understand how this could be. I just graduated. I've only been at this, a couple of years. I have this great opportunity. It's kind of a pipeline of a lot of the internships with MLB.com became full-time gigs. And now I feel called out of that. How is this possible? And so I start talking to people in my life, and I kind of laid out, I think God's calling me to write novels, write fiction stories. Well, as everyone's listening here, very few people say, I want to go be an artist or a writer and tell it to their parents or others in their lives. And it goes very successfully. Why? Because normally it's like, well, when are you going to get a real job? When are you going to do this? And this is actually just this incredibly sad thing. There's truth in it, right? There's always truth in like, hey, you got to provide, you got to do this. Art's a hard thing. Do it on the side. But boy, you can miss a lot if you do that. And so 95% of the people were saying, don't do this, including my own father. And there was one couple that I emailed who happened to used to work in journalism and got called in the ministry. And they said, Caleb, if God's calling you to it, man, this is like a trapeze situation. You got to just let go and let God. We've been doing that for the past 30 years, and God has been a wonderful safety net. And I was like, wow, that's incredible. And spectacularly, God starts speaking to me for the first time in my life. I'm talking not an audible voice, but mid-March, something's happening in mid-March. I have no idea what this is. This is not something that I grew up with. This is not something that our church grew up with. I'm telling my wife, something's happening in mid-March. I don't know what, but this is like a drumbeat in my soul. And so I'm out covering a game, and I get a call from a friend, and he says, hey, I heard you want to write more. Like, God's called you to write. I'm like, yeah. He's like, well, I think I have a job that's going to help you do that. I go, really? What is it? And when is it? And he said, well, it would be at retirement apartments, and it opens up in mid-March. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. God's making it that clear. That's insane. And so I'm like, well, great. God, give me the job and then I'll do it. And it was like this right away, Holy Spirit being like, no. You're living differently now. You're living by faith. And I went on a drive because I kind of wanted to do the Gideon thing to God. Give me the job and then I'll do this. But I had never lived in faith ever in my life. It was show me the end of the tunnel and then I'm going to take a step into it. Instead of, Caleb, go step into the tunnel. So I go take a drive, and I realized at the time I was really struggling. Anytime that a father figure says, don't do this, even though you feel called to it, that's a hard place to be in. So I'm sitting there struggling with, man, why can't my dad believe in the result I'm feeling called to right now without seeing anything first? And I realized, oh my gosh, this is what I'm doing to God. God, give me the result, and then I'm going to take a step. And that was all I needed. I put in my 2 weeks notice, and within a week, not only did I get that job at the retirement apartments, but I landed a literary agent after years of submitting my work. And so it all just came together like that. And that was the first time I lived by faith as a 20-something-year-old. And it was just a beautifully moving time in my life.
Yeah, as you mentioned the Gideon moment there of, talking about the fleece dry and wet and all that stuff, and God kind of confirming things. And as you were saying that, I thought about the other, major Gideon story of where he's showing up to battle with thousands of people, and God says, hey, I'm actually going to whittle this down to just a few hundred, and I want you to watch me work. And that's, very much like what God's doing with you in this stage. He's like, hey, you bring what you have, and I'm going to really be shouldering the rest here. I just need you to trust me. And so, I think that's where the most excitement in life really comes from, is when we're like, hey, here's what I got, God. You do what you want with it. And he's like, all right, now it's game time. Now, I'm interested to hear, what this phase of life was like for you, but what God was planting, the seeds that God was using, especially as you were kind of really entering into this new journey, not only in writing, but really with God in trying to hear his call and respond. And like he often does, only gives you one step at a time. And he's like, I've got the rest of the plan in mind. You just work on the one step I've given you. But where did you see now, looking in hindsight, how God was kind of working through that time to get you to where you are today?
Oh, there was so much going on at this time. At first it was like there was a high and then a crash. Like, what am I doing? I just gave up my career. I'm walking through the halls of retirement apartments. What is going on? But during this time, not only did it teach me to be incredibly tenacious about craft, I have 3 values that I wrote down. And these actually took a long time to get to, because I think there's a big difference between aspirational values and values that exude from you, kind of the way God shaped you. And for me is craftsmanship. God created me to be a craftsman, to study something. Like, my wife and I spent our wedding money on 52 books on writing. We have been students of story and the craft of it since we were teenagers. And even before that, we were active. She was an active journaler. I was an active, writer. And so this gave us the opportunity to really work on our craft and become the best version of ourselves when it came to writing that we could be. And meanwhile, God invited us into an intimate snapshot of the third of life, where now I'm sitting every morning at 6 a.m. with 12 members of the greatest generation, a sea captain, someone who worked at NASA, Boeing, incredible wisdom, incredibly amazing people who really know themselves. They've been through so much. They've experienced so much. And I watched that table dwindle from 12 down to 2 over the years that I was there. And I realized these are libraries of wisdom and values burning up, never to be heard of again. And the saddest part was that those conversations that I was privy to, that I got to be a part of, were lively and active. I learned that ages of the mind, that these men and women were my age in their mind. Their bodies had gotten old. The experiences, the tooth had gotten long, right? But when their families came to visit, there was such a relational disconnect. There were bridges that hadn't been built. And so that's what I'm saying. These libraries were like closed and they were never being opened because the work hadn't been done of grandson or granddaughter couldn't see that grandma or grandpa were just like them. They didn't know that truth today for them is the same 3,000 years ago as it is 3,000 years in the future. And story is what binds that to one another. But they called them the silent generation for a reason. And I think that is one of the most insidious things, for lack of a better term, that the enemy can do is to silence us, to not share our story, because that is actually where God gets the greatest glory, is show us not just Paul writing the New Testament, but Paul murdering Christians. It's always in the contrast that story becomes so relatable and understandable. It's in that failure instead of successes. I know that's a lot, so I'll go ahead and pause there.
Yeah, I think we're going to come back to several things that you just said, and I want to continue to hear how your story has played out to get you into what you're doing today. But I just wanted to mention, this is a theme that's been coming up over the past year or so in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus talks about when you pray, when you fast, and when you give, here's how you ought to do it. And here's things you ought to, be careful of. But a few people have pointed out that we probably have more stories of prayer and maybe even fasting than generosity or giving, because it seems to be separated from other spiritual disciplines, if you will, because it feels very personal. And I think there's a complex dynamic going on there. But have you seen that to be true in your own life or in working with others, that there might be a scarcity of stories around giving?
I think that they're on a high level. I think there can be the idea of, hey, don't let the left hand know what the right hand's doing. I talk about money the way that I talk about power and status as well. I call them the ring. My wife and I are huge Lord of the Rings fans. And so we know with power, status, or money, we're dealing with something very powerful that can be very destructive, but that God can use for amazing things. That kind of gets weird with the ring analogy, but just go with me on it. I think that it's not so much the story as it is, we all know that money is a thing. It's a tool. So I think what lacks is not necessarily the stories of generosity. It's the stories of the person who's being generous. For instance, one of the first questions I like to ask people is, what breaks your heart in the world? What's the personal gift that God's given you to give to the world? It's money follows where the heart is. So I think what we're seeing is a dearth of where's this coming from of these dollars that are going out for a very real purpose? Show me why that is. Everyone has a very deep reason why we're called to do something. And so very few of us are generous with what that is. And that is where God does his best work, because frankly, it's probably going to come from something that's going to humble you. It's not the easiest thing to be humble when everyone's praising you for the amount of money you're giving and, oh my goodness, look at you, and you've worked so hard and you give so much. You have to give yourself. And if you don't give yourself, you're going to have a hard time really capturing the meaning behind what God is doing, because this is not your money. We're great at saying we're stewards, not owners. I'm sorry. I've heard that from a lot of people who are not stewarding the depth of themselves at all. And that's where God does his work. That's poor stewardship. So I think there's a lot there and a lot to unpack, but I think that yes, money can make it awkward, for lack of a better term. It's been said that if you can talk about money, you can talk about anything. Well, if you can give yourself to anyone, then you can give your money in a way that completely separates it from you and totally makes it about God.
Yeah, I think a big aspect of what you're getting at there is really the difference between giving and generosity. Generosity inherently, the term really encapsulates the heart aspect of the act of giving, whereas giving, when it really comes down to it, is just an action, and you can give without heart behind it. But generosity is really where you get like the fruit of the spirit kind of weight behind that action.
Mm.
So I'm interested for how you got from the season of life you were in to Renown. Where did God put those pieces together and, launch you into this interesting journey that you've been on in the last number of years?
Fun story. Signed with a literary agent. He was the son of the person who found Max Lucado and the Prayer of Jabez guy. I'm like, wow, this is so cool. God's paving this way, opening this door. We pitch, we write. I'm going to conferences every month. While we worked at these retirement apartments, we got a day off a week. And so we would save up our days off to go to a conference, a writing conference. So we'd be meeting agents and editors and agents and editors. And finally meet Kathleen Kerr at Harvest House. And she offers me a 2-book deal. After, it was the craziest thing. She had heard me pitching to someone else. And by the time I pitched to her, it was like a year or two later. And she's like, I remember him. And like, it was just one of those, again, a God thing, right? So I get the 2-book contract. And as I'm writing the first book, there's some momentum building. The publisher, normally for a first-time author, it's like, okay, we're going to take a chance on you, but like there ain't going to be many resources for you. And all of a sudden there's momentum and they're shifting budget around. And now all of a sudden, I'm an introverted guy. I'm not a huge put myself out there, but God was like paving the way. It seemed there was Jefferson Bethke, Jesus Over Religion. His book was going big. He agrees to write the foreword. Margaret Feinberg, Randy Alcorn, Josh McDowell, all these names who you would recognize. And then Caleb, Breakey. It didn't make sense to me. So these things are being opened. And now talk shows, radio shows, they're putting more budget toward the book. My wife and I, get speaking engagements, all these things. And this was like what we would call in the hero's journey. This was the false peak. It's where everything seems like it's going great, but it actually wasn't. What I learned very quickly, as someone who grew up in a church that was, everyone looked the same, sounded the same, was the same, I got to find out a lot of things about myself. Number one, and I know it's going to be impossible to convince anyone of this, but I am a 100% introvert. My energy drains very quickly when I outpour it into people. And I love people. I love giving that energy. But the way God built me is that goes low and then I need to recharge. And so while I was doing this, I realized I'm not made for this. 2, the idea of getting on stage and speaking or teaching, that's not really my gift to the world. It's not what gives me life. I was getting nervous. I was getting stressed out. The idea of pain in your neck, like I was getting stress in my body because I'm a behind the scenes guy. I like to fan the flames of others. I don't like to actually be on stage. And so am I even being successful in making movement forward in the right thing? And I wasn't. So what do? I'm a craftsman at heart. I've left my career. I've got the thing that I want and I'm building momentum. But by the time I'm writing my second book and just marketing the first book, I am exhausted. I'm toast. There ain't no way I can start a family like this. There ain't no way. I'm doing the wrong thing, essentially. So I go, you know what? What if I helped others tell their stories? What if I was the director of being able to capture this and bring my expertise to it in a way that, going back to that language, fan the flames of the big-hearted, amazing people in this world? Or for the family, when my grandparents passed away, my family really dissolved in quite spectacular fashion of the lawsuits and this. And so I tell people that the big vision for my life is that people would value their story as much as God does. And the way I do that now is by championing human flourishing and family harmony. So you got the leader who's building something. You have the family who wants their legacy of values and wisdom to endure. And that's where the big shift happened. Those were the big aha moments of like, oh my goodness, now that feels like breathing to me. That feels like I was put on earth to do this.
So Caleb, what was that moment where you realized that you were called to start Renown?
It's funny. Years later, after processing this, it's hard to eat my own words of go back into the hard moment. The hard moment was after about 2 or 3 months of marketing my book, my first book, and writing my second one. I was supposed to have a year to write it, ended up writing it in 10 weeks because I was so focused on marketing. I go, well, I need to continue this. I'm in the rat race now. I need to continue writing books in order for this to work. And I did not get a third contract. It was desperation. I was almost fetal position. Like, God, I thought you called me to this. I thought I had this beautiful step of faith. I thought you laid out all this. I thought you pushed this book in a way that is making things happen. And now I'm here and I've got nothing. It was desperation. So sometimes God uses, not sometimes, all the time, God uses that hero's journey of about 70% is either I don't know what I'm doing or I'm failing doing it. Or I'm driven by, and we don't like to say this in Christendom, like I'm doing it for not the best reasons. I'm desperate. I got to put food on the table, right? I was desperate. But out of that, looking over my shoulder now, I'm like, God, you're so glorious in how you shaped all this because you use my humanity, but also the beautiful redemptiveness of who you are and what you do in our lives, and you match them perfectly. But desperation is where it started.
Yeah, and I think that's how a lot of stories, or a lot of, good stories, evolve out of, as you could probably testify to yourself. So you mentioned these two groups, leaders and families, and I'd love to hear what your experience has been in getting to work as you started actually building out this process. What has it been like to basically amplify all these stories and start to draw them out and make them real, which clearly seems to be pretty aligned with how God has designed and called you. So I'm sure you are seeing some more of the alignment fit than what you were just describing. But, how has some of that process been like for you, and how has it evolved?
So I believe in the power of transformation. I don't believe just in the flat power of numbers. In fact, my relationship with numbers, in this instance, let's say readers of books, it isn't too moving to me. And here's what I mean by that. So behind both people that I serve, your active leader, builder, doing some amazing things in the world, and a family who is, they're managing their wealth, but are really struggling with the wisdom and values, that third sort of why, stepping into that legacy. I have two big BHAGs. For the leader, I want to see in my lifetime the publishing industry reversed. So right now, everything is driven by celebrity status or numbers. And it essentially comes down to how many books you can sell. I want to flip that around to get the right people with the right stories influencing society from the top down, meaning Jesus, top down. And one of the ways that I do this is by focusing on your book. We're not looking at any bestsellers list. We're not even trying to market this like crazy. What I just sent to about 12 of my authors was a little book, and I personalized it, made it beautiful for them. But I said, the book says, lives your book will touch. And I challenged each of my authors to think of their own personal changed my life bookshelf, and that their only goal is to get on these readers change their life bookshelf. Books should not be for everyone. Society shouldn't just be this, hey, everyone read the bestsellers and then we're going to be great. No. When you think about a book, when it reaches your hand, a lot of it comes down to being in the right place at the right time. This is the right stage of life. So for instance, I got my brother-in-law the book, The Defining Decade, when he was 21. I'm like, man, what a perfect time for this. I look at books as they really transform the world when the author knows exactly who that book is for, writes them a note, personally calls them and tells them why they're giving them this story. And that actually becomes a catalyst that the Holy Spirit uses in someone else's life. A great example of this is we're working with someone who created a powerful ministry in the Middle East. He somehow is able to stand at these intersections of cultures that just want to stay away from each other, East and West. And his funders were kind of scared that he was getting old and stepping away. Like, all this work, all this progress is going to be lost. How do we do this? And so we are capturing his wisdom, his knowledge, his experiences of having built this ministry, And our goal is to get that wrapped up into a book, into a story, into wisdom to give to those kids in college right now who God's calling to the Middle East, to not reinvent the wheel, but to pass along something very powerful. Like, it's not just about a sale of getting someone to buy a book. It's about getting it into the right hands. And so I don't ever really want to write a book just to get another book in the world. I want the book to be narrowed to a point where if we get it into the right 100 hands, God is going to use it incredibly powerful. And so I may have got a little carried away with that question, and I'll finish it with this. On the family side, I think we have a lot of families who are incredibly intentional with their wealth. You got your estate planning, you got your attorneys, you got your wills, you got these things. But ask anyone what they would like to move forward to the next generation and make sure it's there. And you give them wealth, wisdom, or values, they're always going to choose wisdom and values. But their actions are going to say wealth. They're thinking way more about the wealth than they are the other two. Getting to invite patriarchs, matriarchs, families into that conversation and what that may look like to bring intentionality to your values and wisdom, it's a beautiful thing from the top down.
Caleb, I'm thinking about the times that I've shared my own story, and I think throughout life it's really changed and evolved, and I certainly have not mastered it, but I think a lot of times I kind of want to play my highlight reel for somebody, hoping that they'll think differently about me or be impressed even, and it's like, here's my resume, what do you think, in a way. And then other times I want to present myself the way that maybe I see myself when people aren't around. So I'll go into a story where I have to become vulnerable. And, that feels a little risky sometimes because the person might be like, why are you dumping this on me? I didn't ask for that part of your story, but you said it's important to have that contrast. So how do you work with people to tell their story in a way that's not just compelling, but accurate as well?
We have to normalize failure. We have to normalize telling the truth. I put on maybe 5 or 6 workshops a year in person. I'll do online, but in person, this is a very fun, empowering thing. And I'd say workshop because that's very different. I don't like to teach, but I love to facilitate workshops. And this workshop that I put on for people is walking people through the hero's journey, basically through the lens of just marking down moments in their life that they can share. And the most powerful thing about this workshop is that you invite people into what it means to find that balance of this authenticity, truthfulness, giving yourself in a way. So the very first part of the hero's journey is like, give me a snapshot of your life. And usually that comes down to moments that ingrain some false beliefs that have really become parts of your arc of your life that's taken years to overcome. Like, I can tell you both right now, I may have met Jesus as a 20-something-year-old at that writing conference. I couldn't say that God loves me and I'm perfect in his eyes until I was in my mid-30s and actually mean those words. I mean, I wanted to whip myself. I wanted to cower in shame because I was taught that that's what God did. He beat you into submission, and that's about it. It took years. We're talking 15 years to get to the point where I could say God loves me and actually feel it, embody it, mean it. And so when I share people with my snapshot, I'll share with them about how I grew up in a place where emotion was wrong. Therefore, I thought I was wrong. I share something as simple as I remember loving going to the water slides. And then, a girl had looked at me and said, ew. And I remember thinking to myself, I am ugly. I remember being homeschooled and being kind of scared of seeing the school buses and then going and taking a standardized test and failing quite miserably in every subject but one and thinking, I'm stupid. So you've got wrong, ugly, and stupid at a very young age by 3 very distinct memories. And I can tell you the moment in my life, and we're talking way later, where I actually got over those. And my wife would probably still tell you that I'm still working on the ugly one. It's amazing what gets ingrained in us. If we don't know that, if we don't know where the starting point is, then we're not going to be able to see the beauty when we are transformed and we're the exact opposite. That's the hero's journey. Where did you start and where's God taking you or finished you in this stage of life? And so to be able to invite people by being able to model that type of authenticity, is it awkward that I just shared that with you? Or is it, man, I see myself in that. It's different, but I see myself in it. That is the point of story. What is true today, the hardships we have, the false beliefs we have, the I'm this, I'm that. Again, they were true 3,000 years ago, they're true 3,000 years in the future. Even things like one of our parents, what if they lost a friend today? They grieve, someone's died. That's grief. It's death. That same grief can be found in a 17-year-old who just got broken up with by their boyfriend or girlfriend for the first time. It's not actual death, but it feels like it. It's the same human emotion. When we share our stories, everyone else is looking for themselves in the story. That is how we're wired. We're actually looking for ourselves in the story because we're trying to learn how to navigate life ourselves. And too often we think everyone's looking at us as if we're like on display, or like our story is somehow this unmentionable thing that's probably never happened in the world. It's like, no. Actually, you're just one more viewpoint, but are you willing to allow others to see themselves through it? And so to be able to give that gift of going first, we just need more of that. That's what invites people into this powerful place of transformation.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And, that's one of the reasons that led us to this podcast, is because story has been so powerful in the generosity community, because people can see themselves in story, especially like, this is, what my life looked like. And then I began to kind of step out in generosity, and this is what it has unleashed in my life that I had no idea to expect. And story is very powerful in catalyzing that. I know you get to work with a lot of generous families and leaders, and I'd love to hear just, from your experience in really going deep with a lot of these families and individuals. What are some of the themes that you have come to, or even some of the ways that God has kind of stretched your understanding of generosity or faith through working with a lot of these families?
Wow, the themes. I think one of the biggest themes I've seen of this work, and I've had one person repeat it back to me before they got to the end of the process. Only one, but the rest of them get there. And that is, when you tell your story, when you write a book, there's a product there. There's something that's out there in the world, right? When you go through the process of telling your story with great intentionality, it will do far more for you than what you think the project itself will do for others. This is something that requires a microscope in the life of every follower of Christ. I think it was Socrates said, the unexamined life is not a life worth living. And we have it right there in scripture. Like, God looks at the heart. And I got to tell you, I do not meet very many people who can tell me their story, who can talk about their story for more than 30 seconds outside of it, maybe a couple snapshots. And I like one of the words you used. You said, I think, catalog. Our story is a catalog of how to connect with other people. You asked me a question. I know my story. I know where I connect with something. I know how we can dive deep together in a certain way. This is what your grandsons and granddaughters are counting on you for. This is what your reader is counting on you for. You have seen what your life is about, and you've invited them into the experience of it. Because you can't teach experience, but you share your story, and story does the work of teaching, of inviting. So one person I've worked with, I think I may have shared this before, but his whole story is an ability to rest. His whole story is about his struggle, just trading haymakers with, I can't rest, but I gotta rest. I can't rest. And God invited him through this story to now teaching others how to Sabbath. Literally the struggle, the pain became the purpose. For a family with your sons, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, I think there's this false belief that, man, we're talking about words like wisdom, values. Those are big concepts. Like, that's what I know I should be about. But I feel like that's almost like, that's too big thinking that I'm thinking about. And so there's no intentionality there. When you start to put a category to each of your stories, you have a way of sharing something of wisdom without ever having to prescribe anything. I think people freeze at the end of life because they feel like, oh, I'm the old one. I need to prescribe how to do life right. That is not right. The next generation and 2 generations after, they need to hear 4 things, and that's it. And you could put this on one piece of paper. I love you. I'm proud of you. Here's how I messed up. Here's what I hope for your future. If you've done that, that's all the prescribing you need to do. What they need in great detail is how those values, how the wisdom you have, how it was formed, because they need to get there on their own. And the way to do that is through story. You don't tell them you are a person of integrity because you are my son or daughter. No, you share the story of how you learned and demonstrated integrity in your life. You share the story of, like, one of our clients, when he thought he was God's gifted business, everything he touched turns to gold. Then his partner is found with cocaine in his suitcase, and boom, it all comes crashing down. And his lawyer saying, you need to declare bankruptcy yesterday. And he says, I don't feel comfortable with this. I can't do this. And he goes, well, that's not the way the world works. And he goes, well, this is the way I feel like God wants me to live. Calls all the people he owes money to. And he says, even if I can only pay you $5, I will give you my word. And that's all I have to give you, that I will pay this off. And he did that in 7 years. And God went on to bless that man to the tune of, I want to say, a $30 million a year company. That's integrity. That's the story. That's where your sons and daughters, your grandsons and granddaughters are not being told what to do. They're showing what's in their blood, how God moved through their grandpa, and that's in them. And they have this demonstration of what integrity is. And here's the other hard thing to realize, is that we can learn more from our failures than our successes. Even sharing the stories when you didn't walk in integrity. That's inviting the next generation to put themselves in their shoes and to get there on their own. Because I tell you right now, we all know what it's like to be taught something. And it's usually, no, thank you. Like, we're not wired for that. We're used to get there on our own. And that's what story invites us to do.
Caleb, as someone who's studied writing and storytelling for your whole career, what can we learn from the way that stories are presented in Scripture?
I mean, it's the Jesus way, right? I understand that there's a good amount of story and teaching, and we even talk about this when we work with our clients. We talk about how there is stories that are completely 100% show and not tell. That is like the Rest story I told you about. That entire story is an invitation into just watching the movie of Rest from A to Z. There are other stories where, similar to Scripture, you have Jesus saying, hey, there once was a man who blank, but then maybe there's some description of what it meant. Sometimes he didn't tell him what it meant. Sometimes he did. So another story we're doing, it's an allegory. And what was cool about it is the allegory is this man's life beliefs. He has 10 life beliefs that are wonderful, and they're coming out through allegory. And at the end of each chapter, we have what we're calling a wise heart principle. And it just captures just the beauty of what we just saw in the story in a very chunkable, like, wow, I get that. I get that. Like, I should take life seriously, but not myself so seriously. You know, little things like that, little nuggets of truth. I mean, Scripture shows us that you have this beautiful blend of Jesus, the master storyteller, inviting us into story, and also seeing all the stories throughout Scripture. What do we talk about? We talk about Gideon today. And I even forgot about the Midianites and God taking the number down to 300. It's like, oh, are you kidding me? But how cool that he shows himself powerful in that. You have story after story. Paul, Murdering Christians is writing, where there's this blend of what does it mean? And, I like it. I think it was Jeff Goins, another writer, who said, writing should always have a point, and rarely should it ever be spoken. What I liked about that is that it leaves room for the reader to grasp it themselves, but also there is a time to give the reader the nugget that you've. And what I love about that particular book I told you about is that it follows someone from high school until married with kids. What a cool thing. And I shared it with a young person not long ago. And he was like, this resonated with me so much. I'm about to graduate college. And from looking over my shoulder to now looking in the future, I see the principles that are critical to my own personal growth and success in this world and as a follower of Christ.
Over the last 5 years, Keel and I have talked to hundreds of people about money, about giving, about generosity, and these themes that can feel very personal and private. And there's been a lot of hesitancy to share, but we've also been blessed to hear from people who are very gifted in telling their story and sharing wisdom and imparting values through storytelling. But I've lost count of how many people who I sense that they tell themselves that they don't have a story worth telling, or they don't have a story yet, or they're not sure how to tell their story, specifically where it comes to things around generosity and giving. And I can pull out all kinds of different references to scripture, but I think in the stories like we hear on this podcast, so many people see themselves in those stories. And it's not that they're going to replicate and do everything that that person did, but they are recognizing some human connection in the telling of the story. But what advice do you have for people who are maybe still exploring, they're early in their journey, either with faith or with managing money, or just aren't really sure how to make sense of it all?
Just as you were talking there, Cody, you kind of messed me up good, because I shared with you the vision that I have that God's put on my life that people would value their story as much as God does. I come from a 3, now almost going on 4 generation car dealership family. My family loves cars, especially classic cars. And my whole childhood, I was taken to car shows. My dad owns like a 35 Ford, a Jeep FC-170. My brothers built their own 68 Mustang Fastbacks from scratch, like beautiful cars. And we would go to these car shows. And we would walk 2 feet and we would stop. And my brothers and my dad would be looking at the bumper and the tires and, ooh, this is stock. And oh my goodness, they didn't change anything. They just repaired it. And they would look at the interior and the exterior. And we would walk around that car until there was nothing left. And then we would read about it and flip through the pages of the book of its restoration. And then after we'd kind of had our fill, walk 2 steps and now to the next one, bumper, the tire, all over again. That is how God views us. God knows every hair on our head. He knows the second we were born. He knew us in our mother's womb. He has a plan for you. You have never not had an incredibly important story. There's no such thing as a story waiting. It's happening right now. And if people could just take that, if people could know that God actually sees them, loves them, knows them. What was that great study about? Everyone needs to be seen and heard and understood. I'm telling you right now, all those things, you have an abundance already by your Creator. And if I'm the enemy, I want you to feel like you ain't got nothing and your story ain't worth nothing. And you have to achieve something before you have anything to say. You don't. You have to be willing to share of yourself and start slowly. Just write what we talked about, create a catalog of those experiences where you were tested, where you were put through the fire, where you were challenged to do the right thing or not the right thing, where you failed, where you succeeded, where in your relationships, at your work, there's so many of these things already happening, whether you're 12 or 84. But know that you are that special, crafted, worth stopping and looking at each part of you, even if for me, who wasn't into cars, was bored to death. God isn't, and other people aren't, because we're all cars. I knew this analogy would break down somehow, but that's what I want you to take away from this. Like, we have got to get over that belief, that lie of the enemy. Because if you think you don't have a story, you're not talking. And guess what? It's by the blood of the Lamb, what Jesus did for us, and the word of our testimony that we overcome. Blood of the Lamb was a one-time event. It is done. Word of our testimony should be happening every day, not tomorrow, not when we think we have it, but every day. And that's not just how Jesus saved you. It's not just that moment that you prayed the prayer. That was a pretty easy day, honestly. It was all the days that came before that. Those are the good ones that led up to the end, or the end of a beginning.
Yeah, and all the days that came after, because there's quite a journey that comes after that point too.
Right.
So you have obviously refined your craft, and specifically in working with families and trying to bring out their stories. I'd love to hear how you would describe your process when you meet with a new family or a new leader or somebody who comes to you and maybe is even saying some of these same stuff, like, I don't really know where my story is or how to tell it. What is the process that you take somebody through to move from a bunch of unorganized memories into the finished product of a story that really does what you said right in the beginning, that is going to move and engage those who interact with it?
So for the first 2 to 3 months, we're really looking at capturing the chronology of someone's life. What happened? It's inventory. What happened? Most people think that that is the end. Hey, we got the history, therefore we have our legacy. But I tell them history informs, story transforms. So once you know the chronology, that's just step one. That's just baby steps. Once we know that, that's where my particular skill set comes into play the most, which is, now that we know the chronology, what does it mean? How do we show it cinematically? So those first 2-3 months are all about getting the information and then figuring out the meaning of it by putting it into an outline that we can see, almost like a movie. How does this need to come out? How will this touch the right heart? We talk a lot about the reader. We talk about being one of those 100 readers who actually, if they read this book, it will transform their life. So that's the first 2-3 months. From there, writing style assessment. Essentially, we consider ourselves as scribes. We call our process, we're co-creating together. This is someone's story that they're speaking out to us. We're just helping them get it onto the written page in a way that's going to allow story to be beautiful. We talk about, we want to bring in the 5 senses, the visual element, the smell, the taste. We want to bring someone into it. We want every chapter to radiate a very human element where someone can see themselves in the story. You know, is it grief? Is it, the struggle with integrity? Was it a moment that someone told you something that you had to do and your heart said no? Things that someone can relate to. And then we want to know exactly what we're offering the reader without actually like hitting them over the head with it. Those are kind of things we want in each chapter. So once we do that writing style assessment, we start to see, is this the right starting point? Did we get our starting blocks? And if yes, then we move forward, where now it's essentially a chapter every couple of weeks where we are co-creating together from the 3-month mark up until about the 9 to 10 month mark. That's where the first draft is done. So usually from idea to gathering all the information to creating a robust outline to actually writing the book, it's about a 9 to 10 month process. I come from traditional publishing. I'm a craftsman at heart. I know that the work is not done yet, not even close. We have a developmental editor, a proofreader, a copy editor who now will be going over the book for the next 3 to 5 months, working with the author to make sure that it's been thought through from multiple angles and now touched about 6 different people, so that we are so ruthlessly committed to that reader who's going to have it at the end and what their experience with this book is going to be like. And then finally, the last 2 months are getting it formatted and published. And this can take a variety of forms. It can take the mass market where it's paperback, hardcover, audiobook, or it can be highly specialized. About 5 feet from me, I have a stack of specialized books that were created one-off print run just for a family, highly designed family photographs, a beautiful font, something that you couldn't just order on Amazon, without having to stock their inventory. And so that would be more for the family. I think about when it comes to a family, we want it special. I know that this isn't on video, but like we'll create like legacy boxes for each family member with their story inside, along with a letter to each son and daughter, because we want to make it special. I always tell people that you get out what you put in. You get out what you put in. It is really hard to get a great legacy out of something that you're like, oh, I'm going to, spend $100 on this and get it done in an afternoon. That's probably what you're going to get out of it. You have to make it special. You have to make this box, even though, yes, everything's going to be saved in the cloud and whatnot. You want someone running to grab this box if their house is on fire. You want this to be the valuable thing. And so that's what we try to create. And that's our process. Our process is usually a 16 to 18 month process. Right now, we're currently serving about 12 clients a year. We have a wait list, and I've been in this tension and talking with God about, I know who he's called this company to be and how I should lead it and our values of craftsmanship. And we are to never grow beyond that craftsmanship, meaning there will be people who do not fit our process, who, want something done faster, what have you, but we're called to serve a very few, but in a very particular way. What's happening outside of that process is I love doing work I love with people I love. And so I am thinking about gifts. I'm thinking about handwritten notes. I'm thinking about things that I can encourage my clients with. I want to make it surprising. I want to make it delightful, because if I don't treat this process of sharing your story as sacred, how can they ever expect this to be a sacred thing to give others? And so I treat the process of sharing your story as sacred. And that's what I invite people into. And that's really quite hard to scale. So it's God only brings a few people to this point, and I want to be the company that's there waiting for them when they're there.
So, we've talked a lot about sharing your story, about the mechanics of that and a lot of the meaning of that. I wanted to come back to something that you touched on a little bit earlier, which is that in the same way that, on the podcast, we talk about stewarding wealth all the time and the many iterations of what that looks like in all kinds of different facets of life. But you touched on the point earlier that we are responsible for stewarding our story too, and that has just as much impact on our families, but on many around us. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on how people can be good stewards of their story. And I know part of it comes from what you mentioned not long ago about valuing your story as the story that God has been writing in your life. But what are your thoughts about stewarding story?
I think the biggest thing that we need to overcome mentally is the idea that sharing our story somehow steals glory from God. I mean, this is like calling good evil and evil good. And we need to get to the point where we see our stories as God's glory. If we don't get there, then our stories will continue to be trite, trinkified, little sound bites that include zero invitation into the transformative power that God's working every day. And we're invited to it, but we're sitting in the nosebleed section if we think we're stealing glory from God when we share our story. It's not our story. Humans share a very human experience. We can either sit next to someone who's 20 years younger than us or 20 years older than us and think, how am I ever going to connect with them? They're a boomer, I'm a Gen Z or a Gen Y. Or we can say, oh, I remember when I went through this at this age. I'm going to share that. What a great starting point. He's in high school right now. Looks like he's going through this right now. I'm just going to share this story that I remember that was very similar. The power of story, again, it's not there to glorify us. It's there to be someone else's life raft. Think about how separated we are. When you think that Gen Z or Gen Y can't listen to a baby boomer or a different generation because of the gap in age, did humanity change at all outside of technology? No. Everything this kid is facing, you have already faced, and it is criminal for you to keep your mouth closed. Now, no, that person does not need prescription. They do not need to know how best to do life. There's plenty of books that they can go find on their own if they want that. They need to know how you lived, how you approached it. What happened when you got your heart broken? What happened when you went through your divorce? What happened when you couldn't put down the bottle? What happened when you said, God, I don't know if you exist because all these horrible things are happening to me? What'd you do? Your story is someone else's life raft. They're going through it right now, man. If you can treat others as they're going through something, and you know your story and you look for connection points. That's the thing about knowing your story. It's been said that legacy moves at the pace of relationship. I mean, that's pretty much true of everything. Your ability to connect with other human beings goes at the pace of your relationship. Relationship is tied to trust. Trust is tied to story. I need to know you've walked where I'm trying to walk. I need to know you've been there. It's hard for me to speak with a heroin addict because I've never been addicted to heroin or some other drug. Someone else has, who God has captured their heart, and they're going to be able to speak into those demons, those moments, those things that someone feels like no one can relate with because no one's lived my story. That's what we kind of all think. It's like, no, the Bible told us right there. There ain't nothing new under the sun. Anything you felt, thought, been tempted with, anything, it's there. But are you brave enough to allow God to speak to another through your story, even if it carries with it shame, guilt, fear? What is the verse? I did not give you a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of self-control. What if you could bring that in your story? When we have fear or shame keeping us from sharing our story, the enemy has effectively won 1,000%. If you are driven by, this person could be drowning, I'm going to share my story of when I was drowning and see if maybe, just maybe, what I experienced in the past, it will help them as they experience it now.
Yeah, I think something that's gained through hearing the stories of others is often hope. And it may not be that you want to be exactly like they are today, but just there's so many moments where we do feel like we're drowning and we're like, I don't see a way that I make it out of this, hole. And it's like, it's going to be okay. But I think we owe it to ourselves to be curious and to see everybody as a story that God's been writing since before the beginning of time, and to just approach life that way. And that will help us tell our own story as well, certainly. But there's so much to be gained by approaching others with that genuine curiosity. And that's one of my favorite things about spending time around generous people for the last 5 years or so. And what I've noticed is many, many of the people that we've gotten to hear from have not lost that sense of curiosity. They're still going, hey, I was reading this parable for the 345th time, and it just hit me in a totally new way, right? It's not just because Jesus was the master storyteller. It's because they maintained that curiosity and that openness that there is still something that is to be learned, even if you've been walking it out for decades. What can we truly master? So, Caleb, this has been a lot of fun. I'd love to hear, what are you most excited about when you think about the next 5 or 10 years?
I've been very excited about, my wife and I have both been very passionate about telling the right stories. As we were building our company, a lot of ego came our way. And there's nothing wrong with these things inherently. I want to be a New York Times bestseller. I want to do this. I want to do that. And we've had some books do that. But at the end of the day, I felt like I was just a part of a machine, a part of other things that were just, and you read about these stories of, oh, they paid their way onto this bestseller list and they did this. And it just felt like building someone's platform instead of the platform, like kingdom platform, if you will. And so my wife and I are both very passionate about seeing people. Like big-hearted people who love Jesus are usually the last ones who will ever receive any sort of attention. Let that sink in. This is true in Christian circles and non-Christian circles. And we like to give them props for being the ones who are doing work when no one's watching. But boy, we love some celebrity culture, man. And it's not that I want to throw these people into a celebrity status, but those, I believe there's incredible wisdom and story to be gleaned from, to be put out there, to an invitation to us all to find those people. And we, as the body of Christ, can do this. And what has me excited is that we have now started to do that. We are now partnered with Impact Foundation, where we now have the ability to connect people's donor advised funds to the point where they can find and nominate the right story and have that person walk through our process so that we can amplify what God is doing through them. We've seen this at a tangible level, like International Justice Mission, where we found the right person who is going to help push the message forward in fighting human slavery and trafficking. But there are so many untold stories who are the right people doing amazing work in this world, where if we use their story, it could be an amplifier of the good of what God is doing. That really has me exciting because it strips away any sort of semblance of the power of the ring, if you will. Power, status, money. It basically takes all those motivators away while only amplifying the work of what God's doing. And that makes me feel like I'm doing exactly what I was meant to do. Like, invest in the few, but those few are going to be impacting thousands, if not millions.
Yeah, that is a really cool process. And I think just like we've seen in so many other areas of generosity, when you align all of that correctly, then it really strips things down to really what's most valuable in the process. It just cleans all the motivations behind things. It's just hard for us to do on our own, I think, in so many different, all of us. But that's a really cool structure that you have there. And I'm excited to see what comes from that too, because I'm sure there are some really cool stories to be told coming from that lens. As we get to the end of the episode, we like to end every episode with our manager's minutes, just a practical action our listeners can take to step into their role as stewards and manage God's wealth wisely. So Caleb, do you have a suggestion for our listeners today?
Yeah, just even as I was thinking about this, we use that word, categorize your story. Take some time, like write down a story that no one knows. Write down a story that led to a false belief. If you would like help on this, I have a little worksheet that goes through a truncated version of the hero's journey. It's what I hand out when I'll do a workshop in person or online. I'd be happy to send that to anyone who wants it. It's better when you get a walkthrough, but you'll get the gist of it based on the question. But start outlining your story. It is a powerful process. And then give generously your story. Like if you are in touch and tuned with the Spirit, your story becomes this whole new light within you of understanding how to use your words, when to use your words. Sometimes we need to be a listening ear. Other times our story, again, is someone else's life raft. How in the world can you give something you don't even know you have, or you haven't thought through? You haven't made that list essentially of what your life has been about and what those moments have been. We're here to step into others' lives. And you may feel like, well, I only feel comfortable with this type of person or that type of age or this stage of life. And it's like, when you know your story, God can use you even through bringing that to the surface. Spirit's going to nudge you. Share this little part, share this story. And that's incredibly powerful. So basically write it down. Write down something that no one knows yet. I'm still learning things about my parents that I had no idea about. And the only thing that kept it from them is they're like, oh, we don't want our kids to do what we did. It's like, trust me, they'll figure it out just the way you did. Trust me. Don't wait for perfect words. There's no such thing. This is why we tell stories around a campfire. It doesn't matter if you're, some fancy flowery writer or just a cowboy around, talking about the story. The fact is, great story makes you forget the storyteller. Remember that. You should be forgotten as you tell your story. This is not about you. It's about the human experience and us looking at it together and going, wow, isn't that interesting? Curious. What are we learning? What's God teaching us? It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. And that's not one we've had before. So I think that's a perfect way to end this episode. Caleb, where can people learn more about Renown?
Yeah, check us out, renownpublishing.com. It'll take you to a simple page where you can either click on Renowned Families or Renowned Leaders. And everyone usually knows which side they are in. And once you click on one of those, it'll just give you a lot more in-depth information about either one of those paths. My email is caleb@renownpublishing.com. Feel free to reach out anytime. I love emailing. I love if I can send you that resource of the Truncated Heroes version. Just send me an email. I'll send you a copy and tell me your story. I love to hear it. So that's the best way, is either renownpublishing.com or caleb@renownpublishing.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Caleb. This has been a really fun experience to get to dive into this. As you know, we've been sharing stories for a while now, and just to get to pop the hood and see really what's going on under the surface, this has just been a lot of fun. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is such a privilege and an honor, and I hope I treated today as sacred.
Thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any of our references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 147. Before we finish up, I have a quick question for you. Have you ever stopped to answer the question, how much is enough? Financial Finish Line is designed to help you do just that. Our 90-day Finish Line Pledge breaks down the process into 3 easy steps. Step 1, define how much is enough for your family to spend in a single month and use that as your monthly spending budget for 90 days. Step 2, as God provides money to manage, set aside any margin outside of your finish line into a separate bank account. Step 3, after 90 days, explore the millions of ways you can use that margin you've set aside to create joy, purpose, and impact in God's kingdom. Want to learn more? Check out our website at finishlinepledge.com. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.